Hello and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. I'm Mr. O'Hagan and I'm here with Mr. Zagari.
Hey guys, how we doing?
Today on the Underground, the Civil War and the myth of the lost cause. Our discussion today was inspired by a book that we both read in the last few years and were really moved by. So apologies if we go a little longer than our normal 10 to 12-minute length, but we promise it's worth it. The book is titled Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause. Special shout out to Mr. Wiedenhoft who read it first, and he really pushed us to
He
to
sure
move
did.
he
He
pushed
sure
it
did.
to move it up our reading list. So Zags, can you tell our listeners a little bit about the author and his motivation to write this book?
Sure. Ty Seidule, who's the author of the book, and he's a retired professor from West Point and a brigadier general. He is also a proudly born Virginian who, in his own words, grew up thinking Lee was more than the greatest general of the Civil War, more than the greatest Virginian. Lee was the greatest human being who ever lived.
Wow, that's a whole other level and disturbing other level of hero worship, it seems.
Yeah, no kidding, Mr. O'Hagan. I mean, this view of Lee was tied directly to the lost cause narrative that permeated Southern society and schoolrooms from the late 1870s all the way through the 1970s and even into the early 1980s. It's not until the modern civil rights movement that historians are forced to revisit this 100-year-old narrative and call it out for what it was: a fabrication, a manipulation, a lie. Maybe you want to give us a brief overview of this lost cause myth there, Mr. O'Hagan.
Absolutely, Zag. So the myth of the lost cause is a narrative that emerged after the Civil War, and it's had a very strong, lasting impact on how we understand that period of history. So, according to this myth, the Civil War was not fought over slavery, but for states' rights and the preservation of the Southern way of life. African Americans were loyal and content as slaves. The Confederacy was defeated only because of the Union's overwhelming advantages. Confederate soldiers were heroic, and Robert E. Lee was the most heroic of all the Confederates. And, not forgetting the ladies, Southern women were loyal and sanctified, meaning they were made holy
Mhm.
by the sacrifice of their loved ones. For my Star Wars fans, I'm going to channel Luke Skywalker here. All right, if he were here, he'd say, amazing. Everything you just said is wrong. So, Zags, what makes this myth a myth?
Well, let's start with number one. It's not about slavery. Well, let's listen to Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens in 1861 talking about the new Confederate Constitution. Here we go. The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions that's relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that the slavery and subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition.
That, my friends, is what we in the legal world call an admission of guilt. I mean, he tells you
Yeah.
flat out it's the immediate cause, right? All right. So, what about this idea of African Americans as happy and obedient?
Well, slavery was a brutal system that denied basic human rights to millions of people. Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, the Grimke sisters, all firsthand examples of people who saw slavery for what it was. Slaves escaped whenever possible. They engaged in countless acts of passive resistance. They celebrated the end of the war, likening themselves to the biblical stories of the Jews being let out of slavery in Egypt. Who can even say the words loyal and content slaves with a straight face?
You know, Zags, Sigily's book really shreds the whole military heroism nonsense, too. Southern troops deserted at least at the same rate as Union troops, and the Confederacy was forced to institute a draft even prior to the Union. So it's not like they were dripping in volunteers. So let's ditch these notions that the Confederates were more committed to their cause. And by the way, let's call it what it is. It's hard to call somebody a hero for fighting to take away somebody else's rights.
And let's talk about here, what about Lee, the military genius?
Yeah, not so much. That one we can punch a hole into. The South only needed to tie. Right, they had to fight a defensive war to win here, but Lee's ego made him overly aggressive.
Mm.
He needlessly led men into battles where he suffered heavy casualties in some of these early battles, and he was wasting his most precious resource, which was men. Any chance of a successful Confederate war effort was done by 1863. He failed to take advantage of a badly divided American army, which also struggled to find adequate leadership. By the way, American Army is what Sidgley says we should be calling the Union Army. That's we can go down a whole rabbit hole if we
Yeah, we
stick to that
sure
one. So
can.
I'm going to hold off. But
Yeah,
but the long and the
absolutely.
short of it is, man, Lee was no genius. And Southern ladies, sorry, ladies, you don't get credit. With apologies to Tammy Wynette for all my country fans out there, you don't get credit for standing by your man when your man was so wrong.
So, if we knew that there are these giant holes in the narrative, why did it take root? Why was it accepted and embraced for like this is embraced for almost 100
Right,
years?
right. You know, I'm not, this is not my thought, but it was a way for Southerners to cope with the devastation of the war and to
Hmm.
justify their actions. James McPherson, the great Civil War historian, has called it a psychological need to reclaim their morality. Let's not forget their whole system has been rebuked, it's been defeated, and therefore they've been defeated. So, what they needed to do was repackage their original goals and their original mission into something more legitimate and admirable. It's self-deluding, but sometimes reality is too much to bear, and clearly it was for the people who latched onto this lost cause.
And especially for the people at the top, the plantation owners.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
There was the strongest desire to keep the structure in place that will allow them to stay at the top of society. So they lose slavery, but they implement the Jim Crow laws and sharecropping and literacy tests. And they have the gall as part of this myth to say it's for the blacks' own good. That's the same happy and content slave nonsense they peddled even before the war.
Absolutely.
It's the same story over and over again. And you have poor and middle class whites are really manipulated by the wealthy plantation owners to support a system that benefits them in only one way: status.
Yeah.
Take away the black underclass, and poor whites have nothing. So they have to agree to the lie or give up that one benefit. This is the Southern social hierarchy just in a post slavery Southern society.
I have to be honest, that part really isn't that hard for me to get. I always understood the Southern buy-in as to why you recreate. You lost, so
Hmm.
you want to come out with a better version. But it takes two to tango. So why did the North, the victorious
Yeah.
North, why did they allow this narrative, this story of the Civil War, to be hijacked by the loser of the conflict for all these years?
That's a great question, Mr. O'Hagan. And racism has to be acknowledged here. We have to remember the North was never fully committed to black equality. Historian Eric Foner reminds us that the North resisted slavery because they felt economically threatened by it. They were all about free soil and free labor, as in the market revolution idea of this economic freedom. The moral concerns of abolitionists were not the dominant sentiments. Most Northerners were never really interested in promoting equal rights, just wasn't part of their narrative.
Yeah, so I think that's something we always have to keep in mind. That anti-black sentiment was very strong in the North too. You know, they weren't great champions of freedom or black rights, and you see all through the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s. There's a persistence in popular politics and popular culture of anti-black sentiment. You see it in the literature, the political cartoons, even consumer products.
Hmm.
Boy, this struck me the other day. I was looking this up because I was interested to find this out. So the Pearl Milling Company adopted the character Aunt Jemima.
Oh, okay.
Now, even
Yes.
for our listeners, these guys grew up with Aunt Jemima pancake syrup and
Sure.
pancake mix. Well, Aunt Jemima was taken from a character popular in vaudeville minstrel shows where exaggerated stereotypes were played for humor. Amazingly, the Aunt Jemima character name were only removed from the packaging in 2020 and 2021. So that's an awful but stark example of how racial stereotypes were perpetuated by just those consumer products. And that's all over the country. It's not just the South.
Yes, and David Blight, the Yale historian, suggests that factors beyond racism also influenced Northern acceptance. In his book, The Civil War in American Memory, Blight contends that acceptance of the myth was also a way to mend the wounds of the nation and to move the country forward into the 20th century. I mean, I am sure the North was also thinking they wanted to get back to business. The West was being settled, the railroads were expanding west, and it was time to move on. In addition, migration patterns were status quo. The thought of a
Right.
mass African American exodus from the South did not happen. And to be honest, many former slaves stayed on or near their
Right,
plantations.
right. So Northerners didn't have to face they weren't faced with the ugly reality of what was happening to African Americans in the South after the war because they didn't see it. And if Southerners want to talk about how brave Lee was, so what? Northerners
Mhm.
can say to themselves, "We know who won," and it's easier to buy the lie when you don't see the damage that lie is doing.
Exactly. It's exactly right. And the mass migration of African Americans to the North did not come till World War One, some 50 years later. By that time, the lost cause is ingrained in the minds of Northerners, Westerners, and Southerners. It's the lie that everyone agrees to. Well, not everyone, of course.
No,
You still
yeah,
have folks like W.E.B. Du Bois
right.
who rallied against it, but certainly the vast majority of white Americans bought into this lie.
Very true. In the professional ranks, it's historians in the 1970s and 80s who really begin to challenge this lost cause. So, the question that I feel kind of is a vital one for us to ask is why did Ty Seidule feel compelled to write this book now? What is it you think that really triggered him to say, this is the time when
This is
I
the
have
time
to
to
I have
write
to
it.
address this book?
Yeah, and I mean, you have to think of it. It wasn't a sudden realization for Sidgely.
Okay.
He grew up with this, let's use College Board terms here, his
Yes.
thesis that Lee was a god and the lost cause was the gospel. But his years of study, his years at West Point, recognizing the celebration of Lee and other Confederates with their names plastered on the buildings and cadet barracks struck him as counterintuitive. Why are we celebrating these men who committed treason at the end of the day?
Yeah.
These men who broke their sworn oath to defend the nation. These men who violated the sacred trust supposedly instilled in them by their time here at West Point.
So Sidgley found himself with the historian's problem here, didn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, okay, let's put this in College Board terms. Sidgley's initial thesis about Lee and the lost cause was his personal and professional story. But as his professional career progressed and he did the research and studied the records, his evidence, the documents, so to speak, did not support his thesis. He had to rethink the argument. What did the documents really tell him? That's the question. What did these documents really tell him?
Well, that's where those counter arguments that we brought up before,
It's a nuanced approach.
it is indeed, but it really began to inform his thought process and re-inform him about this issue. As a result, he's become a very active petitioner of the Defense Department, getting them to end the U.S. Army's
Mhm.
memorialization of Confederate officers for whom forts and military installations have still been named. Fort Hood, Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, all of these were U.S. Army forts that were renamed as recently as May of 2023. And those are all Confederate officers for whom forts and installations have been named. So Sidgley was also a supporter of removing those Confederate statues, a controversy that many political figures weighed in on in 2029 and 2020. So how do you think that position of opposing the statues, how does that align with this anti-lost cause motif that he stresses?
Well, many of these statues were placed at a time when African Americans were protesting for more rights at the turn of the 20th century. These statues were a celebration, a symbol of the lost cause, and therefore a warning that those protests would fall on deaf ears. The South will enjoy this home rule, the code for Southern society as we knew it in the previous antebellum years.
This is such an important book because it's a history book, but it's also a current event book at the same time. The ghost of the lost cause is still with us. It took root over 100 years. Seems unlikely that we're going to get rid of it entirely in less
Hmm.
than 30 or 40, but
Right.
Sigil is definitely trying to move us in that direction. And he's passionate that if we don't make this adjustment, if we don't reinterpret the history, if we don't have it as a more accurate depiction, we run the risk of perpetuating this endless cycle of bigotry and conflict that has marred the American story.
Well, that's all for today, folks. We know it was a longer one than normal, but it is a topic worthy of our attention. Please see the description below for additional resources. We have some great resources below, including Ty Seidules's speech at his alma mater, Washington and Lee University.
Washington and Lee. Oh my
Well,
gosh.
Lee, I mean
Okay.
that's
That's a can't miss video.
a can't miss video for sure. And also be sure to use this YouTube channel for its content spotlights, unit reviews, A Push on the Road segments, and other spectacular podcasts. We'll see you next time on the U.S. History Underground.
See
Take
ya.
care.